Hi everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture on photography and identity politics. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the idea of identity politics, think in terms, it's a broad category, but think of in terms of how important it is that representations of ourselves and the social groups that we are identified as belonging to, how important that is to our sense of self, to the way that we are understood in the world, to our access to power, to a whole host of things. One of the ways you might start thinking about the importance of representations of different social groups or ethnic groups, or today I try to shy away from the idea of race, because race is as much a construct as anything else, and yet it comes along with the idea that somehow there are these intrinsic and really well-defined separated races that I find to be a problem, because frankly I think it primarily promotes the idea of white privilege and frankly white supremacy. In any case, think of how important it is that representations and the way that they define various social groups, whether this be in terms of gender, sexuality, race, or ethnicity, has a huge impact on both the way we think of ourselves as well as the way that others think of us and define us, and subsequently give us some kind of sense of ourselves and also our access to power. And a good example of this might be, imagine yourself with, most of you probably have various platforms for your social media. Imagine someone hijacks that platform, Facebook or Instagram or what have you, and they just start, showing you the way that they want to show you. They put the pictures up that they want to put up of you. Maybe they even put up pictures that aren't of you but say that they are, and caption all those pictures with whatever they want to say about you. Obviously, I think you're going to feel both a lack of power, a lack of control of your own representation in the world, and probably, with it, a loss of self-esteem and so forth, depending, of course, on who hijacked your social platform. So basically, then, what we're talking about today is how important photography has always been in terms of representation. We've been doing a lot of work trying to talk about how, while on the one hand photography creates within us a kind of reality effect when we see it, and on the other hand how incredibly coded a photograph is, meaning it's filled with different types of meanings and allusions to other things out there in the world, and is constantly being understood through all of the other representations that we know about out there in the world. So today what we're dealing with is, on the one hand, something that we start with, thinking of the way that photographs were and daguerreotypes were so heavily used right after the inception of photography to self-represent. You would go get a daguerreotype. Everyone could do it at that stage to represent yourself. And remember, early on, they're even doing their own forms of self-representation that are obviously, a bit fictitious. They will go to a photograph studio and have themselves dressed in particular clothing or against a particular backdrop. We all do this. We know that, representations of ourselves are representations. They're not perfect, accurate reflections, let's say, of our deep, soul or sense of self, our identity. Now, then take this one step further and say, and many of you do, that you belong to a minority group of one sort or another. And by minority groups, I just mean those who have less access to power than the typical kind of prototypical, person in power, which is frankly kind of someone like me, a white heterosexual male who becomes, in our Western culture and frankly almost pan-culturally, the quintessential kind of figure that is imbued with privilege and a sense of self and access to power, and frankly there are very few prejudices, in other words, against people in my position, a white heterosexual male. But if you are a woman, if you are a member of a minority ethnic racial group, you're not white in the United States. If you are not heterosexual, if your gender, falls between various, defining polarities, you're not cisgender, you're transgender, or however you define yourself, these are all minority groups that are oftentimes misrepresented or represented in a way that is less, let's say less privileged for sure, but oftentimes damaging to one's access to power. In relation to men, women have always been defined as less than. In relation to white, people of color have always been defined as less than, and the same with sexualities and all of the other components of a minority subcultural group. So a huge component of this are various groups recognizing that one way to combat the various stereotypes and what they find to be misrepresentations of themselves individually and the social groups that they are understood to belong to is to take over these representations, to control them, to produce your own representations that counter those that are projected onto you by the majority culture. This is what we call identity politics, a recognition of how important the representation of not only individuals but social groups is to our sense of self and to our access to power. Because if others see us according to the misrepresentations that are, proliferated by majority culture, then of course we are going to be seen as less than by culture at large, as well as probably somewhere deep within ourselves by ourselves. So then let's look at a few of these. We're going to work our way through this kind of systematically, and frankly, it's a huge category, right? We could have spent all quarter, in fact, I teach a course that's basically on art and identity politics, an online course, Art History 270, that spends a ton of time on this, and a lot of the artists that I deal with there are also very interested in photography. But in any case, we're going to look at a small little sampling of feminist artists, a little sampling of artists of color, black artists in particular, and Iranian artists, and then some gay and lesbian artists to kind of end up, as well as groups that use photography in the service of identity politics. So we'll start here with Carolee Schneemann and just get some terms out there. Carolee Schneemann was an artist who was basically in grad school in the late 50s and started producing art in the early 1960s in New York. She was a dancer as well as a performance artist, and photography was a big part of her art. She is oftentimes grouped into a number of artists of her generation known as first-generation feminist artists in the United States. And this is let's say, a loosely defined group. As a generation, they all have their own interest and idiosyncrasies, but one of the kind of standard ways to define this group of artists is to say that these artists came of age at a time following the 1950s where a lot of agitation around gender issues had begun to be talked about in the social realm. This is the realm of the time of Betty Friedan's famous text, The Feminine Mystique, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, the rise of what's known as the second wave of feminism across the globe, but also in the United States, where women are arguing for some basic equalities, thinking of women as equal to men. But one of the things that makes this group a little bit different than what we call the second generation of feminist artists in the United States is that they didn't so much seek to displace the ways that women had always been characterized in relation to men. If we think about the way that any definition works, it oftentimes occurs that one term, in this case the masculine or the male, is defined in one set of ways. So, for instance, men are oftentimes thought of as being rational. Now, I'm not saying any of these things are accurate, by the way. I'm just saying traditionally, these are some things. Rational, aggressive, they're the breadwinner. They are out there in the public realm and so forth. Whereas women get defined on the other kind of pole, on the other end of what we call a binary opposition. So whereas men are rational, women are thought to be emotional. Whereas men are seen to be aggressive and assertive, women are understood to be passive and receptive. Whereas men are out there in the public realm, women's realm is the private realm, and on, right? So what I'm saying is that this first generation and people like Carolee Schneemann didn't do so much to displace that binary opposition of masculine and feminine. What they tended, not all of them, but what many of them tended to want to do was to revalue and redefine those characteristics that had been ascribed to women or woman or femininity for ages. So what I mean by this is, so for instance, let's say you were understood to be emotional, of the body. Well, instead of seeing this as a negative or less than being rational, women of this generation of artists in the United States sought to revalue this, make those things just as important as the masculine side of the binary, and to redefine them, because you have to redefine them in order to revalue them. So the emotional might be something like intuitive. The emotional might be something that is understood as dealing with the complexities of the human psyche, and all of its strangeness, rather than something that is less than the rational mind. So that's a big part. The other big part, though, is something that gets pretty controversial, and it's not entirely clear. At various times, a lot of these women of this generation tended to be searching for characteristics that they conceived to be in some way essential to women. What this means is that essential or essentialism is the idea that intrinsically men are one way and women are another way, that there is something biologically fundamentally different as a part of human nature that we're born into the world that makes men better at some things and women better at other things. And there's a lot of controversy around this, of course, today, where we are much more curious, I think, in general, about the idea of gender fluidity rather than these stark binary contrasts of man versus woman. To essentialize identity is something that becomes a problem, too, in the political realm, because if you say women are, by their very nature, essentially good at emotions and not very good at being rational, then what about all those incredibly, and I mean the vast majority of women who are incredibly bright, very rational, very strong thinkers, and don't want to be pigeonholed into being good at emotions, right? But in any case, this was a first kind of move by feminism, and it was important for them because it brought women together, right? If you say that something is shared in common among all women, then one of the things that you have on your side is building a constituency of a lot of people around shared characteristics. So that's the big idea that we'll be looking at. The other one for Carolee Schneemann is the term the male gaze, the way that women's bodies, women's sexuality, the way that women are thought of is defined by a man, by the man's gaze. So our major example of Carolee Schneemann's work is I, Body. I, Body is a series of, it was a kind of private performance. There was a series of photographs taken of her performing for the camera in these poses. She's completely nude. She has done a number of things that, for the purposes of this class, I'm not going to go into. The grease painting on her body is part of a private ritual. She was, at this stage in her career, working, you'll see in the background of this photograph, this big installation / collage. She had been working on that type of painting collage in her own work, and then she decided to open this up to include herself performing with these big installations, so as she put it, to associate her as a woman creator with her creations. She was basically inscribing her body into her painting collages. But along with that, the thing that I really want to focus on here today is how Carolee Schneemann, in this private performance and photographs for a performance, is seeking to do something that has to do with revaluing and redefining women's bodies. What she's trying to do in this performance, because again, the photograph was supposed to capture something of the reality of the liveness of this performance, as if you were actually there. And she was in control of the poses that she's taking, supposedly, and what you would see. What she's trying to give you a sense of is, if you were there seeing her perform, how that would be different than looking at photographs that are produced by men of women for men, eroticism, pornography, and so forth, where a woman becomes objectified, right? This is the major idea behind the male gaze, that it represents women as objects of male desire. Now just stop and think about this for a minute. I know you've heard it before, but an object is, by its very, definition, not a human being. It's just there for the viewer. So women become represented in erotic photography and pornography as not human beings with their own desires and their own needs, and frankly their own dislikes and distastes and feelings and all of that complexity. They're just there for men. It puts all the power in the man. The man becomes, as we say in art, a voyeur. He gets to look at these photographs that are produced for him without fear of the photograph or the woman in the photograph judging him, thinking you're not good enough for me or whatever, because those women are always compliant and there for you. Now, what Carolee Schneemann was trying to do is something opposite. Now, whether it works or not is completely up to you. I think the fact that these now exist only as photographs is a little problematic, but what she was trying to do is take control of her own self-representation and represent herself as a sexualized body, right? She's sexualized, but she's not an object. She's a subject or an individual with her own desires, her own needs, her own decision-making, right? She's there, she's sexualized, but she is not there just for you. And in the actual performance, one can see how this would be the case. If you are in front of another live human being, it's, let's say, a lot more difficult to objectify than if that human being is just a representation in a photograph, right? So, in other words, what she's trying to do in a lot of these photographs is to take poses that are very provocative and very sexual, but make you think of her as a human being who is sexualized, who has her own sexual desire. She's a sexualized subject, in other words. And what this is doing is redefining and revaluing female sexuality, not as a bad thing, as it was framed. For instance, you see the snakes here in the Bible as Eve tempting Adam, Eve's sexuality being something to be fearful of, but rather something that is beautiful just in the same way as, male sexuality is a great thing, a component of the self, something that gives pleasure, something that's about self-expression, and so forth. I set these two images up next to each other, Carolee Schneemann on the left-hand side, an eye body, performing for the camera with these snakes, and on the right-hand side, a 19th century painting by William Bouguereau of Venus, the birth of Venus on a half shell here, to say the right-hand side image is all about the objectification of the female body. It's beautiful, right? But it's there just for the male. She doesn't look back at you. She allows you to look at her. It's all just about the heterosexual male and him projecting his desires on her. Whereas the work on the left, Schneemann's work, is at least at the level of intention, meant to make you think of a real human being who exists there, who is, once again, sexualized, but not just sexualized for you. It's like two human beings in an erotic or sexual encounter who have to if they're being, I think, good human beings, negotiate each other's desires and likes and dislikes, and treat each other as if you are both equals, which doesn't happen in a lot of the representations of women, particularly in terms of sexuality. So as identity politics, again, she's trying to take the way that women have been represented as sexual objects and instead represent them as sexual individuals or sexual subjects. The other component of the snake here is not just a reference to the way that Christianity has negatively defined female sexuality. It probably also refers, at least obliquely, to earlier cultures such as the culture of early Crete, Minoan culture. And this figure that you see here is a small faience or glass fertility, well, we don't know if it's a fertility figurine, but probably associated with fertility, known as a snake goddess. Now, in Minoan culture, we believe that it was a matrilineal culture, meaning that power and prestige was oftentimes passed down, and wealth, through the mother's line rather than the father's line, and that women controlled, or at least had places of high power in the religious proceedings in these cultures. This woman is probably a priestess, right? And here you see snakes and bared breasts, which are symbols of fertility, believe it or not. A snake is a symbol of fertility, or the life, birth, life cycle, in the sense that a snake curls up into a spiral. The spiral is a symbol of the cyclicity of life. Snakes, of course, have power over life and death in the sense that they can bite you and kill you. But also their venom was used in ancient Greece. We don't know so much about Minoan culture, but one presumes this is the case too. As a curative, it's something that was used to cure people of various ailments. It's still used that way today. And of course, snakes are phallic looking and crawl in holes in ground, so that's sexualized imagery. And finally, snakes shed their skin, which is seen as kind of rebirthing themselves. In fact, there's a lot of speculation that early Judaic culture actually framed the snake in the Old Testament negatively so as to gain power over many religions known as earth religions that didn't worship the snake but thought of the snake as a very, very powerful symbol, including Egyptian culture. So here, in other words, what I'm saying is that women's proximity in, let's say, earlier cultures that worshipped ideas about fertility and fecundity and the cyclicity of the universe because they wanted to ensure the birth of healthy children, the growth of crops, the proliferation of their herds of animals for food and so forth, that women had a high place of power in those cultures because their body was very similar to the processes of life, birth, life in nature, since women's bodies can give birth, can feed life, through nursing, and frankly, women's bodies go through a menstrual cycle that mimics the cycles of the lunar calendar in a process of life, birth, rebirth, and so forth. So many early feminists of this first generation will look back at these earlier earth religion societies, something known as the Great Goddess, which is an idea of the eternal feminine, and in particular matrilineal societies, and associate themselves with these earlier moments in time where women were more highly esteemed than they perceived them as being in their own current day. Another example of this is the work of Mary Beth Edelson. Mary Beth Edelson is also in New York. She came onto the scene using photography very prominently in her work after painting for a while, when she created the series of works that was known as 22 Others. One of the components, by the way, of early feminism that brought women together was the belief that while men are very kind of assertive and individualistic, they do things well on their own, women are by their nature more collaborative and communal. And so Mary Beth Edelson, what she did is she asked for suggestions from friends and colleagues for works of art for her to create, and she called this series 22 Others. It was a collaboration then with others, and then she would make these works. And one of the suggestions was this, and I'll just read you this quote. This work, by the way, is Some Living American Women Last Supper. The suggestion was, quote, make a piece of art, the style, technique, scale, etc., to be determined by you. I would like for you to use organized religion as your point of departure. I would specifically like for you to use your art to expose whatever negative aspects of organized religion that might occur to you. I would like for this work to be literal, allegorical, with political, philosophical, social implications obvious. This was a suggestion by Ed McGowan. In any case, what she came up with here, and this is, again, very common, and I don't want to offend anyone who is Christian. It's not about that, but if you were to look very carefully, particularly at aspects of the Old Testament, but it's everywhere to be found in the Christian Bible, you're going to find a lot of ways that women are framed or conceptualized very negatively, right? And it's not in many books of the Bible, it's pretty hard to imagine, these rules existing in our laws today, like a woman caught of adultery, whether it's her fault or not, will be stoned to death and so forth, right? So she looks at Christianity, and by the way, she's studying a lot of early earth religions, things like Minoan culture, where women are a lot more privileged and hold positions of power within these spiritual traditions. And she thinks, what would it be like if the major religion of the West was populated by women instead of men? That's one component of this. So she's taken a picture of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, a famous work of art by a famous male artist, of Jesus and his apostles in this last famous meal, and she's substituted the faces of important women artists for those men to make us think, what would it be like if the major religion was filled with women, not men? What if Jesus wasn't a male figure? What if our God wasn't conceived of as male, as, by the way, most prehistoric cultures thought of the major gods as female, the major figures as female, because they were associated with fertility and fecundity and life and death forces. What would that be like, And would that religion have unfolded differently? Would that, by extension, make the priesthood all filled with women? The Pope would be a woman and so forth, instead of, as we've heard over and over again, women being excluded from positions of authority in Christianity and most of the major schools of Christianity. That's one component of it. Another part of this, though, is just in terms of representation and what we call visibility. We see here, it's basically it's a little over 100 women, all told, almost 100 women here, who are all contemporary practicing women artists in the world at this time, being shown to the public. Where were these women being shown otherwise? They weren't being shown in art magazines. They weren't getting gallery representation. So here is a woman artist making visible women artists, both who exist before her and during her own age, to say, hey, who's paying attention to these women? The other part of this is related to visibility, which is this. It does make a difference in the world when we, for instance, as men, wake up and we look around and we see positions of power occupied primarily by white men. Not exclusively by any means, but primarily. I mean, I wake up in the morning and my sense of the possibilities for me are confirmed by looking out in the world and recognizing that, every president ever of the United States has been a man, that more CEOs are men, that more professors are men, and so on and so forth. What would it be like, guys and women, if you woke up in the morning and the roles were reversed, as they are here in this inversion of gender, where all of the presidents had been women, where the majority of the CEOs were women, and on and on and on? Think of how different that would be for women to feel that possibility of access to power through seeing representations of that in the world around them, and how kind of delimiting or how your loss of privilege as a male might come about if you were to wake up in that world, right? Then take this one step further, because this is coming out. Notice that most of these women are white women. What if you started thinking in terms of race? We just had a really good example of this. When Barack Obama was elected, although Barack Obama by his politics is fairly centrist, right? He's not way out on the extreme left, except by the standards of the extreme right. And so what I'm saying is he's not like an extreme leftist liberal who is about dismantling the power structure in the United States. You looked at people of color witnessing this, and you saw it, people crying in joy and relief and the hope of potential of what this could mean in our world. That was, it seems to me, at least in part, a recognition of how important it is to be able to look out into the world and see represented to you people like you in positions of power and prestige as part of your potential, as part of your possibilities. And that's part of what this is about. Just very briefly, a lot of her photography, this is still Mary Beth Edelson, is her doing private performances for the camera again that are then manipulated by being painted with various symbols. This is the Woman Rising series, and this particular one is called Moonmouth. As she explains, these, quote, "These photographic images were defining images, not of who I am, but who we," meaning as women, are. The images were presented aggressively as sexuality, mind and spirit comfortable in one body. In other words, women aren't just going to be the spirit or the emotional or the body, they'll also be the mind. I was summoning the great goddess to make house calls. The great goddess is this idea that existing in the world, there's this kind of powerful feminine force, usually associated with Mother Nature, that women can tap into. Continuing the quote, "I was summoning the goddess to make house calls, talking to the goddess with the body and ending the dialogue with being. These rituals were photographic evidence of the manifestations and recognitions of a powerful feminine force, every woman." In this one, the symbols are the spiral around the navel which is a symbol of birth, and the spiral being that idea of the cyclicity of birth, life, birth. In other words, the kind of circle of life idea made famous by the Lion King. She turns her body into a face. It's supposed to look a little bit like a face, so as to say it is an individual, not just a body, an object there for you. It's very aggressive and assertive. This gesture of the hands above the head is an early form of veneration or prayer. And then finally, the moon in the place of the mouth, that's that association of women's bodies with the cyclicity of the larger cosmos. The idea that women's bodies mimic the lunar cycle and menstruation, that women's bodies are in some sense a microcosm of the larger cosmos, a kind of smaller version of the unfolding of the universe, right? And so these works were all meant to again, promote the idea of a powerful feminine force, redefine and revalue female bodies and the feminine in more positive terms. They're all manipulated photographs. So again, turning the body into a face, same kinds of symbols here, or connecting women to the larger cosmos here. Ana Mendieta was born in Cuba. She was moved to the United States during the Cuban Revolution as an adolescent, where she ended up in Iowa, of all places. And I'm sure this contributed to a little bit of culture shock, moving from Cuba to Iowa. And she, throughout her entire career, talked about her work as trying to reconnect both to her homeland, to Mother Nature in a way, but also to nature in general, a woman trying to connect her body to the vital forces of the natural world, which she sees as correspondent to being a woman. As she said, quote, "My work is the direct result of being torn away from my homeland during adolescence. I'm overwhelmed by the feeling of being ousted from the womb, nature," right? Mother Nature seeing as kind of the birthplace of all things and being feminine in that way. "My art is the way I reestablish the bonds that unite me to the universe." So Ana Mendieta's use of photography is the way she documents documents her own private rituals and then uses the photographs to exhibit as her art. The series that I'm showing you primarily is the Silueta series. And in this, what she would do is she would go to various locales in nature. She would lay down in nature and commune with Mother Nature, feel connective bonds with Mother Earth to gain power, to feel that connection, to basically center herself in relation to this vital feminine force of nature. It's almost like putting her body into these forms and creating almost like a snow angel outline around them, that body imprint. She would gather in this case, the sand around her, make that imprint. Her hands are once up again in this form of early kind of veneration used in various early earth religions, kind of an early form of this gesture of prayer. And then she would, in this case, she went to the beach shore after making this body imprint, gathered flowers. Flowers are symbolic, again, of fertility and women's sexuality. And she would fill that body imprint with these flowers. And then finally, she would allow the tides to come in and wash that away. So birth, life, rebirth. After all, the beach is a pretty good place to cite this work in that the beach is associated and the ocean is associated with that kind of primordial soup from which we all come. Water being the start of all life, the ocean, it's presumed, being the start of all life on Earth. The tides themselves, again, are associated with women's menstrual cycles, the lunar calendar, and so forth. And so we have that idea here as well, as the tides following that birth, life, rebirth, and the menstrual cycle. And again, all of these symbols coming together. The other part of this is they're transient, right? They're ephemeral. She makes them, and then they have their moment of life, which is, as she says, documented by the photographs, but they go away. They are reabsorbed by the earth. They become part of the energy that then gives force to the next birth or next form of life. Other form of this, this is a documentation of an untitled work from the Silueta series. Some of these images, by the way, would have been sold as her art. She lies down, in this case, in the mud, gathers that earth around her, then she reshapes this body imprint into what's known as central core imagery or vulvic imagery, something that mimics the shape of female genitalia and associates, again, women's bodies with birth and sexual desire, and then further associates women's bodies with Mother Nature and the womb of the earth here. And then she fills this up with gunpowder and lights it off so that she is able to establish a connection to what she calls the four vital energies of the universe: water, earth, fire, and in this case, smoke or air. This is not from the Silueta series. This is from series where she covered herself with basically foliage or things associated with birth and Mother Earth. This is flowers on the body, or this glorious work called the Tree of Life series, where she covered herself with mud and grass and so forth, and photographed herself in front of these beautiful trees, again associating women's bodies with Mother Nature. I'm sorry, this is a really difficult series to talk about, and so kind of brace yourself a little bit. The stories around Ana Mendieta's work called Rape Scene are a little conflicting. One set of stories has it that she basically performed this as a performance for some men who were downplaying the impact of rape upon women. In other words, it was like one of those situations where Ana Mendieta and some of her friends who are women were talking about how horrific rape was, and the men that she was with at the time, this is all in grad school, were minimizing the impact of sexual assault and rape on women, like, well, yeah, it's not that horrible. And by the way, this is taking place during a time where rape was and continues to be represented in various ways in books and films and TV shows, which do minimize it as if it's a minor thing that a woman would be sexually assaulted or raped, when of course we know these types of violences towards women will have an impact on women for the rest of their life. They're not a minor thing at all. So one set of stories about how this occurred is that Ana Mendieta, hearing these things, tried to make the idea of sexual assault and rape more real by inviting or kind of tricking these men who were minimizing rape to stumble upon her in a supposed rape scene in her home so as to see it firsthand. Others have it that this was always staged for the photograph, but with the idea of making rape or representing rape and sexual assault as a horrible, violent crime, and thus impacting us with that reality effect of the photograph so that we didn't think it was a minor thing that someone could just get over. In any case, I'm going to show you these pictures, and if they're too much for you to take, just fast forward through it. They're meant to be very violent pictures of Ana Mendieta, in this case, covered with blood, supposedly killed, bent over this table, so that you would see and feel the visceral bodily damage of rape. Now, as many people have pointed out, there is a limitation to that in trying to make rape seem so violent and visceral and thus impact you through the photograph. You can't deal with the other forms of sexual assault and rape that have to do with non-consent, that are like date rapes or rapes that are not that kind of, beat someone over the head and kill them to rape them, but rather someone who is drunk or someone who's been drugged or someone who's been kind of pressured into a situation. So now we move on to a couple of photographers slash larger, broader artists who are part of what is known as the second generation, or oftentimes known as the second or later generation of feminist arts. And the big difference between people like Cindy Sherman and Barbara Kruger, who you'll see in a moment, and what they do in their art is that they are far, in a way, less interested. In fact, they're antagonistic to the idea that a woman is somehow biologically or essentially a set of characteristics, right? These are artists who are much more inclined towards post-modernist and post-structuralist ideas that gender, along with race and ethnicity, and frankly even sexuality for a lot of people, is a construct, right? Is something that is constructed by societal beliefs, and then we basically interpolate these, we embody these, we act out these roles. We're defined by the representations of gender that exist in the world around us. So I just want to give you a few of these big ideas before we go into the photographs themselves. So let's start with this. What we were just looking at when we were talking about the essential characteristics of women is something very similar to kind of standard beliefs about our identity, as it is usually called. Now, identity really means identical, right? So the identity that we have when we use that term is identical to something we're born into the world with. It's the idea that all human beings are born into the world as unique selves, and then over the course of their life, either things help them to become the person, the self, the identity that they were always meant to be, or hurdles get in their way and block them from achieving that identity. Or another way to put this is, for a long time people believe, and many people still do, that you're born into the world with a soul, and each soul is unique and different than other souls, and that is similar to the idea of identity. Subjectivity, however, which is the term that is thrown around today that has replaced identity, basically is saying that your sense of self is subject to representations in the world around you, that your sense of self is a social construction, that you may be very well born into the world with various predilections, like I prefer to do this, I'm more drawn towards this, that are part of your genetic makeup. But the big constitutive factor on the development of who you think you are, who you want to be, what your aspirations are, what your likes and dislikes are, and frankly, who others think you are, comes from social representations that you have encountered over the course of your life and have made a part of yourself. In other words, it's like you're almost a blank slate or a sponge that grabs things that you find in the world around you and they become constituent parts of yourself. Now, a favorite theorist, a psychoanalyst, who is also a critical theorist, whose name is Jacques Lacan, who became famous in the late 60s in France with a whole host of post-structuralist thinkers like Roland Barthes, who you've encountered before, and people like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault and others, once said, and it became a big idea that a lot of these, both artists associated with feminism, but also with various other identity politics grabbed onto, that in our development as human beings, we go through these various stages. And basically what Lacan is best known for is he takes Freudian ideas and he adds semiotic theory to it in a very complex way. In any case, most child developmental theories start with the idea of what Jacques Lacan calls the imaginary, that before the infant child has a sense of self, they don't see themselves as separate from anything, including their surroundings or their mother, and he calls this stage the imaginary stage. It's a stage of plenitude, of no ego separation. You just see yourself as part and parcel of everything around you. Right around the stage that you're starting to see the child separate themselves from their surrounding, the child goes through, according to Lacan, what he called the mere stage of child development, and this is the most important component of this argument. In this stage, Lacan has it that the mere stage is one in which the child recognizes themselves as separate from things around them, as having their own sense of self, their own ego, through mirroring. And that mirroring might be as simple as seeing their own reflection in a mirror and saying, oh, that's me here, right? That's me. I see myself as separate from mom. Here I am. But mirroring can also be a kind of mirroring that occurs in which a child does something, and I'm going to push this directly into gender terms, although it's not, there's much more complexity to this, but let's say a girl child does something that is very closely associated with what is esteemed or valued in women or in the feminine. So a little girl picks up a ribbon after opening up a present and puts it in her hair and looks at someone else, parents in particular. And the parents mirror back to her that that is an activity that they like, that they also value. Oh, aren't you so pretty? That's so cute. Whereas the boy gets a box and bangs it on something and they say, oh, aren't you strong? Aren't you powerful? In other words, children learn through the social cues that they get, through the reflections that they get back from others, starting with their parents, moving on to their peers, and then finally being a product of representations at large, movies, TV shows, and so forth, mirror back to us what is esteemed from the particular subsets that we belong to, male, female, today even transgender, gay, lesbian, queer, and so forth. We see those in representations and we make them a part of ourselves. The third stage is what Jacques Lacan calls the entry into the symbolic. The symbolic is the realm of representations where we both know ourselves and know others primarily through representations. In other words, I know this is a lot to take, but stop and think about this. We define ourselves and are defined by others in relation to concepts, to representations. We know ourselves and communicate with others through language and representations. And so representations are taken to be incredibly important constitutive components of the self that are, according to this major psychoanalytic term, introjected. We mirror them into the body, we bring them into ourselves and act them out. So Cindy Sherman does this, particularly in her early works, the film stills and the untitled works, which you have been given a long reading about. These are all self-portraits. It's her dressing up in various roles and photographing herself relative to various stereotypes on what a woman is. Now, because you have a very interesting reading that goes through, the systematic ways that you might be thinking about these photographs, I'm just going to focus on a few of them for the sake of time, and you can pick the others up in the reading. Here, for instance, Cindy Sherman dressed and looking at herself in front of the mirror, what she might be getting at, what do you think of when you see this? A woman looking at herself in a mirror. What is this all about? What are the types of representations that exist in the world before you see a Cindy Sherman photograph that help you to make sense of this image itself? Is this a woman in narcissism, a woman in vanity, a woman who is responding to the societal pressures that say women's looks are more important than anything else that she has going for her? After all, that's $1 billion cosmetic industry, right? Most women's magazines are really heavily associated with making women, think about their physical presentation to others. The society that we live in still esteems women's attractiveness, I think, more than anything else. And so is this all figured in this photograph? These are all called the untitled film stills. Or this one, right? Look at this for a minute, and I want you to just kind of think, what is this about? What do you think's going on here? And when I ask this in a classroom, oftentimes what happens is that people will say, I'll put it on this and then I'll move it away from this to another image. They'll say she's concerned about her weight. She's standing on a scale, for instance, right? That's one thing people say. Well, there's no scale in evidence, so why do you think she's worried about her weight? Probably because you're thinking women are concerned about their weight. She's in a bathroom. I've seen this before. It seems similar to those things. So I then understand this picture through the stereotypes, the many, many similar images that I've seen in the world. And that, of course, limits the possibilities of seeing women as more than these stereotypes. Other people focus on her touching her chest or her stomach and say maybe she's thinking of herself as pregnant. And, well, is there any evidence of that? Others say she's trying to look skinny because she's in this negligee. The point is that the way you make sense of this image of a woman is according to all of the persistent representations of women you have seen in advance of this photograph. And she picks up these stereotypes, right? So again, they're all playing with kind of tropes of what it is to be a woman. So on the left, you see a woman, librarian, the sexy librarian. You see a woman, overwhelmed by the city, a woman lying on a bed, a woman with nature, women in front of, trying to check out their looks in the mirror here. Woman here who, again, if you thought immediately like domestic violence, there's no straightforward evidence that that's true, but if you went there, it's because you've seen this represented before, because somewhere probably deep within you, you see women as being represented as vulnerable, as, getting beat up and so on. Women as the angry housewife, right? Images from the 60s. Women overwhelmed by the city, like the entry to this horrible TV series known as the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Or, look at this one. How many different social codes are built into this that help you to make sense of it? Does anyone out there think that this is going to end well? She's set up as vulnerable in a kind of, schoolgirl skirt, looking small. She's got a suitcase next to her. There's no indication that anything, but something horrible is going to happen next. A guy's going to drive around the corner and beat her up and stuff her into the trunk or something. And on the other hand, why do we make sense of this image that way? It has everything to do with prior representations of women as vulnerable, as sexualized in their youth, as as something that is there to be abused by someone else. Barbara Kruger is interested in the same ideas, but Barbara Kruger goes at her questions through photographs that are accompanied with text, kind of photo montages or photo collages that are about, on the one hand, drawing your attention to the way that women's sense of self and the way that woman is understood is a social construction. She's very interested in Jacques Lacan's ideas. So this image called this collage, which is a big poster called "You Are Not Yourself," with a mirrored image of a woman kind of fractured, is a direct allusion to Jacques Lacan's mirror stage. You're not yourself because you're not the unique you always thought you were. You are a product of representations outside of yourself that you have introjected or interiorized or understood yourself through. In other words, you are a representation. You are a social construct. Your gender is not something that is a given or a natural thing. It is something that society made up. Now, in terms of politics, the reason that this, unlike essentialism, is something that a lot of women today continue to push, even if there are biological or genetic factors that condition women to be one way and men generally to be another way, although I think that's pretty problematic, frankly. A lot of people will point out that if you believe that one of the major constituent problems for women is the way that woman is represented, then you can critique those representations and change those representations, and by extension, change the way that women are understood in the world. Now, Barbara Kruger came at photography through being an editor for Condé Nast Productions, and so she saw the way that advertising and imagery and text are used together so as to really compel us to believe what we're looking at, to trick us, by the way, into buying things. And she uses those techniques in her own work. So the hailing gesture of a you, right, that draws us in. The way that this work has a very, very powerful image of a fractured face that makes us think of violence towards women, the violence of accepting these societal constructs about women, what woman is. Or this one called "Your Gaze Hits the Side of My Face," of just talking about the male gaze in a way, talking about the way that a male gaze turns a woman or a real human being into an object, like the sculpture that you see here. Talking in this case how the way that the gaze works in this dynamic is that as a woman, you have to buy into it. You have to reciprocate to the idea that you're just there for men. You treat yourself as if you're seeing yourself through the eyes of men. It's called self-surveillance, right? You picture yourself the way that you want others to picture you, and then you try to self-fashion. So it's a reciprocation in which you look directly back at someone, metaphorically, right? You're part of this gaze. She's saying, your gaze hits the side of my face. I will not reciprocate this. I will not buy into this. Or one of the big ones, one of the ways that the binary of male-female unfolds is that men are often associated with the mind and culture, and women are often associated with the body and nature, right? And if you buy into that, she's saying, like the Essentialists did, with so much of their work being associated with women and Mother Nature, then you give the access to culture and the mind and so forth to the men, and that's what's most privileged in our Western world. She's saying here, we won't be blinded by this belief with the leaves over our face. We won't play into this binary. We will contest it. As her art kept growing, it started with kind of posters using photography, and then became these huge billboards that are taking on feminist issues. In this case, women's access to abortions and women's right to control their own bodies, which is coming up for another test, it seems, in the Supreme Court. And then these days, you're more likely to see Barbara Kruger's use of photography and words and her critique of Western society in the form of big installations where the entire room surrounds you. And what she's getting at here is the way that we're constantly being bombarded by ideological messages in the forms of images and text, and the combination of the two, whether this be television or movies or magazines, or more dominantly today, the internet. And how do we make sense of all that? How do we negotiate all of that? So I'm going to pause here. Excuse me for a minute. I'll be right back. Okay, so continuing on with this, let's move on to some artists of color. And I wish I could spend more time on this, frankly. There's always this rub in a class that's a survey about wanting to give you kind of the key major players in the story, but also give you a sense of how varied the various approaches to some of these issues can be. So this is one of those places, frankly, that we haven't covered as many artists of color as I would like to. We looked at Gordon Parks' work, but there are many other artists of color obviously working in photography, and that's frankly one of the limitations of this class. However, we can't cover it all, and hopefully if you take a class on contemporary arts here in the art history department, you'll come across many more of these characters. It's certainly the case that I try to push that in my classes, and many of us do. So moving on to artists of color, Romare Bearden was an artist who really started working in the late 1950s into the 60s, where he was primarily a painter, and then in the mid-60s, he began doing these photo montages or collages about Black people's lives. He is today one of the most famous mid-century Black artists, primarily for these kinds of collages. Now, Romare Bearden, at the time that he first started doing these works, this is called the Conjure Woman, who is a persistent figure in a lot of his art, was really interested in the ideas by Leopold Senger about negritude, about figuring out the identity and kind of spiritual ideas of being a Black person, those roots being in African cultures, but persisting into the various cultures of the diaspora, including the United States, and trying to find those, locate those in the contemporary world. So, for instance, here is the Conjure Woman for Romare Bearden is that wise old Black woman that every kind of neighborhood, Black neighborhood has. The older woman she's kind of like a holdover from the wise woman of ancient African cultures that you'll go to, that always knows, the deep stories of your neighborhood, who is who, but also has advice, is kind of the sage about everything. She's not necessarily old in Romare Bearden's works, but she's usually associated with a snake that you see here, and holding that snake in her hand, so part of old wisdoms and old ways of being. Romare Bearden, by the way, took photographs out of other places, right? So he takes his own photographs from time to time, but primarily he's taking photographs out of magazines, including Black magazines picked towards Black people, in this case also nature magazines, where he associates the Conjure Woman with kind of the forest and frankly, African culture, but now in a contemporary setting. A better example of his work, one that we can go into more detail about, is Dove from 1964. Again, it's a photo montage, or a photo collage that he'll photograph so he can produce multiples of these. In this case, the title for this comes from the dove that sits above this doorway. It's a symbol of, as Romari Bearden put it, the way that there are spiritual traditions that the blacks have adopted, that while they today are primarily Christian in orientation, come from earlier spiritual traditions. What he has pictured here is black culture, in particular the way that black culture of his own experience in the inner city is oftentimes a culture where the social element of interaction occurs on the stoop, on the steps, out on the street, where in this case you see all of these, black faces and black bodies out on their stoops, one believes interacting with one another, that this is the site of sociality. He also was able to give us an idea through the collage of these images and the way that they're all kind of piled together of the density of the urban experience and the busyness, how everything seems in movement of that experience. Finally, he puts into this a number of I want to say stereotypes of black culture, types of black culture. So if you follow my cursor here, this is the conjure woman again. In her hand is a kind of staff that looks a little bit like the Adusis, that symbol of the Surgeon General of two snakes intertwined. Over here, you've got kind of what he would call the cool black guy, right? The guy who's wearing the platform shoes and the cool hat, and has his own way of walking, and smoking a cigarette. Beautiful black women, beautiful nails, beautiful bodies, beautiful faces here. And just different types of the black experience. And another of these, Black Manhattan from '69, right, trying to give you a sense of what this life is like by pulling together images from the world out there. A few generations later, Carrie Mae Weems' work is something that I think appeals to a lot of people. She's one of the most famous black women photographers of her generation. She started in the late 1970s. In the early 80s with a series known as the Family Pictures and Stories series. This is what you're looking at are images that she took out of 4 generations of her family's picture albums that she exhibited alongside text that is meant to self-represent her own family, her own history, from the standpoint of a black person. In other words, she's taken control of the representation of her family history and, frankly, of black identity. Now, she doesn't try to just pretty it all up. She doesn't try to say, hey, this is all good and this is all wonderful. Instead, what she's doing is playing around a little bit with stereotypes of blackness and, frankly, how certain people buy into those stereotypes, whether they be people of color themselves or whites. Another thing, though, that was very much on her mind when she came up with this series, not just that blacks have to self-represent, but they have to self-represent because if they don't, they can be misrepresented by even the most well-intentioned white people. And what she had in her mind was a famous report, usually referred to as the Moynihan Report. It's a report that was commissioned by a senator at the time, Patrick Moynihan, on the state of the black family. And this report, which again was trying to get to why are there so many problems in inner city black cultures, really well intentioned, decided to go at this question from the standpoint of the black family, which was seen as and judged as different than the kind of normative white family, meaning they took the model of a nuclear family of a husband and a wife, a father and a mother and children as their exemplary model. And then they looked at black families and realized that in many of the situations they would find an absent father and a mother who was at work too much or whatever, and they would judge that, the problems of that family based upon this model of the white nuclear family, and frankly judge black families as lacking. Now, one of the things that a lot of critics of the time pointed out is that while there were, of course, a lot of problems of inner city youth at the time, it's not all locatable in the fact that the black family unit is different than the, let's say, standard model of white family unit. Because, for instance, as many critics have pointed out, that while you might have a fractured family, we have plenty of those in white culture as well, many times there are multi-generation families, meaning that a mother and her children might live with her mother or her aunt or cousins or whoever, who all play and take part in the overseeing of the family, and it's a just different family dynamic. In any case, I don't want to get into the ins and outs of the critiques of this again, well-intentioned study. What I wanted to say is that many people found it lacking in that it was, again, a well-intentioned white senator calling for a study on, with good intentions in mind, but it was problematic because this man couldn't think outside of his own experience. And isn't it then, therefore, important for blacks to self-represent, to represent their own families in their own ways and let people see these in their own terms? And that's what she sought to do. Again, taking 4 generations of her family photos, captioning them, and allowing us to see these. Now, one of the things that people have pointed out about Carrie Mae Weems' photos is they are incredibly, it feels like she's sharing her family with you. And so when you see these, it's very empathetic. You feel like you're being let in. They're intimate, right? And this then doesn't make us think of blacks, again, those of us who are white or not, people of color. It doesn't make us think of black culture as other than us, as different, as something that's, maybe we're a little bit wary of in some way or another. We're being invited in, we're being given these kind of intimate access to our own family, and it can be disarming. It can make us maybe get over some of our prejudices or stereotypes or whatever it might be. But with that being said, she also plays around with stereotypes. This is her father, and the caption says, "Daddy was Susie Q number 1 on the left, and Daddy was Susie Q number 2 on the right. And in the middle it says, Daddy is a ladies' man. The women just love him. He's got so many that he calls them all Susie Q, so he doesn't have to remember one name." Now, I think on the one hand, she's saying this playfully and affectionately, and on the other hand, as a black feminist woman, I know she's criticizing him as the black, what we call today, player, right? That he has kind of bought into the stereotype, and everyone finds it cute that he's a ladies' man and running around from one woman to the next. But she does it from the standpoint of a black person, right? She's representing her family, right? So just kind of intimate photos of the black community, her own family, her friends interacting with her, things that are meant to give us a kind of access to black history from the standpoint of someone who is of this group, giving us that access. She also has created kind of little photo essays. One of the most famous is a series known as the Kitchen Table series from 1990, which I've seen exhibited a number of times in my life. This is a series of photographs that have captions associated with them, but in every time I've seen these exhibited, the captions or the kind of little, they're almost like little essays or paragraphs, are off to the side. And so it's not, you don't look at the photograph and then read what it's about so easily. You can look at the photograph and go see different ways that you might think about these photographs, but it's not a one-to-one kind of linkage. You have to go kind of piece it together. In any case, the Family Table series is, if you're going to pick one kind of narrative that runs through it, it's about a black woman falling in love with a black man, and then basically letting his needs and his desires take over the relationship, and including her having a child because he wanted to have one. And then, of course, this relationship breaks up because she can't tolerate abdicating her own needs for his anymore, and seeking out the strength of her friends to help her mourn the loss of this relationship. So these are all posed photographs. They're fictive, right? This is Carrie Mae Weems herself and the actor playing the man who is her lover at this time in one of the most well-known pictures from this series. It's all set at the same spot, a kitchen table, kind of the site of the family, the bringing the family together around a meal. One central light source above it, and then their interactions that are meant to be filled with possible meanings. So an example of this is you look at this image and it's playing with the stereotype of a woman giving up her needs for his, right? He has devoured the lobster in front of him, and he's got 3 beers in front of him, and his wine's completely gone, where she hasn't touched any of her food and seems to be kind of supporting him, right? She's there for him. Her needs take a back seat to his. It's almost like if someone were to tell you she was his wife and lover, as if she's his mother, which is one of the stereotypes of black couples, that the woman plays a kind of motherly role to the man, that he's almost kind of an adolescent who she takes care of and scolds and lets do his own thing. There's other images here too. The bird cage that's sitting up there, is she trapped? Is this a nod to Maya Angelou's famous I Know the Caged Bird Sings book, which is all about black experience and black ways of dealing with the history of slavery and so forth. Or this really poignant image here. And I put together the text with the image here, since this is one of the places that these two go together pretty closely, although in the exhibition you wouldn't see it this close. On the right-hand side, the photograph of something really common, right? Young girls mimicking their mothers, both of them putting on their makeup. It's beautiful, right? It's this major facet of children and their relationships with their parents, how they mirror what we put in front of them. And on the surface, it all seems wonderful. But then let's say you wander over and you see some of the kind of verbiage that can accompany these pictures, her writing about this, and you read this. Neither knew with certainty what the future held. It could be only a paper moon hanging over a cardboard sea, but they both said it wouldn't be make-believe if you believed in me. He wanted children. She didn't. At the height of their love, a child was born. Her sisters thought the world of their children, noting their little feats as they stumbled, teetered, and stood. When her kid finally stood and walked, she watched with a distant eye, thinking, thank God I won't have to carry her much longer. Oh yeah, she loved the kid. She was responsible, but took no deep pleasure in motherhood. It caused a deflection from her own immediate desires, which pissed her off. Ha, a woman's duty. Ha, a punishment for Eve's sin was more like it. Ha. In other words, the burden of being a woman and having to take on the role of being the mother in her own age, which was expected, that the moms are the ones who stay home, the moms are the ones who take care of the children, the moms are the ones that give up their own, let's say, aspirations for a career life or a social life in order to take care of the kid, which is not an expectation laid at the feet of a lot of men, particularly at this time that she's producing this, is something that she's making a comment on. Relationship breaks down and she seeks the support of her friends. And again, very poignant, almost universal types of stories. Absolutely, men and women of all ethnic groups could go through this same story in one way or another, but this is told specifically through codes associated with black culture. So Shireen Nishat, just very briefly, I've given you a little TED Talk by her about her work that is a separate, not obligatory link that you might want to look at, is an Iranian-born artist. She was born before the revolution, and then she moved to New York, where she's been practicing for the last 25, 30 years or so. Is best known for photographs such as this, photographs of herself more often than not, her face that then she draws on top of in various types of script, primarily Farsi script, that are meant to make you think about the various stereotypes we have about Islamic women, women in particular from the Middle East, and how those stereotypes are inscribed upon these women, become the way that we see them, even though we know very little about them. One of her most famous series is a series called the Woman of Allah series, in which you see this photograph called Rebellious Silence here. In the Woman of Allah series, she was dealing with the way that that Islam frames women, the way that Islam has a number of very difficult, hurdles for women to have to kind of work their way through. And on the other hand, how some of these ideas about the way that Islam frames women are misconstrued, or could be understood as misconstrued by Western culture. So here, wearing the hijab, or in this case it's a chador because it's a longer garb over her head. What is that all about? Well, I think many of us know today it's about women covering their hair, because hair is seen as something that draws attention to their beauty and gets them a kind of attention that they don't want in the world, or they're not supposed to show in the world. They're only supposed to show it to their husbands or their intimate close friends. Now, this is seen by many in the West as something that is bad, right? It's a way of controlling women. But she references in the Farsi script on her face the writings of a famous Islamic woman writer whose name is Tareha Sarfedazeh, I think that's how you pronounce it, who writes that a lot of these ways of covering the face or covering the hair and so forth actually are embraced by women as ways to remain kind of outside of the male gaze, to not be thought of just in terms of beauty and the body and so forth. But along with that, you see, of course, the gun here, and she comes across as clearly Middle Eastern, I think, in which case I don't mean that I know that for sure. I mean, the way that she looks is something that is going to bring me right into the idea of Middle Eastern, right, Islam, because of the headscarf, and then we accompany that with the gun. What is that supposed to mean? I mean, my knee-jerk stereotype is to immediately think terrorist, right? Which is stupid, and I want to chastise myself for that. But of course, we have had linked together so often in the West the idea of Islam and terrorism that it's understandable why we would jump there. She wants, though, to make us think very carefully about why we make that jump, why we make that association. She also, though, wants us to think about how women are oftentimes used in various terrorist activities because they're less suspicious than men, right? That you don't suspect a woman to be by terrorists. I mean, someone who might set off a bomb that they've attached to their body, in the same way that you might be suspicious of women. How women are oftentimes cajoled or tricked, or even, frankly, just compelled by their own religious and personal convictions to play a part in various terrorist activities. In other words, what she's asking us to do is kind of sort through all our preconceived notions of Islamic women and think about them more, to be curious about them, to not just think of them as other, to maybe, for instance, think, wow, Tareha Safarzadeh is someone I would want to go read to see what she has to say about all these things. I want to, think my way through them instead of just jumping to our knee-jerk responses, our stereotypes about others. I'm going to pause here. Excuse me. All right. Thanks for being patient. So we're going to move on now to a few artists associated with GLBTQ arts, but, in a way that's a little bit of a misnomer. We're going to look at a couple of artists who are gay and lesbian artists, as well as activist groups associated with ACT UP, who produce their own works of art using photography in relation primarily to the AIDS/HIV crisis in the mid to late 1980s, early 1990s. One of the big names, of course, in photography among groups of non-heterosexual people is Robert Mapplethorpe. Robert Mapplethorpe was a gay man. He ended up dying of AIDS in 1989 at the kind of height of the AIDS/HIV crisis, who of course is famous for any number of photographs. So I'm going to take you through some of these, and I'm going to talk particularly about some of the photographs associated with gay counterculture and a major idea of Robert Mapplethorpe's, which is the history of art has been populated with images of, in particular, heterosexual desire, images of women in particular. And when you see images of men, more often than not, these images come from the classical tradition of the male nude, but they haven't been eroticized. And the whole idea of gay desire entering into the field of representation, not as a secret affair, something that isn't allowed to be public, but rather enters the public realm and is also a form of high art, was a kind of gap that he saw in the history of representation that he hoped some of his photography would start to fill, would add this element into the history of representation. Should be aware that in most parts of the United States, overt representations of homoerotic desire, homoerotic imagery was outlawed until the early 70s, and then that's only in kind of more liberal states that it was allowed. In fact, the whole idea of homosexual sexual relations, any kind of sexual relation between men in particular, but also women, was outlawed in many parts of the country for quite a long time. In any case, one of Robert Mapplethorpe's most early images that is relatable to homoerotic imagery is this cover that was produced for Bullseye, which was a periodical devoted to gay issues, in particular gay erotica from time to time, that he produced in 1970. And this was an image, it's one of the most overt of the early images that he produced, is about ideas such as, it's a photo collage. So it was originally a photograph that he took of a man wearing boots that then he layered other materials over and then photographed again to create a photo montage. In any case, parts of this have to do with erotica, right? The idea of, in this case, on the one hand, anonymous coupling between gay men with the screens on the side, the anonymity of something that covers up the face here, the obviously important targeting of the male genitalia, which is playfully covered up because, of course, on a cover you couldn't show this, but also draws your eye there. But the band over the eyes is also associated with the anonymity of police photographs of people who are caught doing gay acts that were oftentimes part of the arrest record that were used. And he's talking about the way that gay culture is also targeted by law enforcement and those who are homophobic. You know, in not all of Robert Mapplethorpe's work is associated with this type of imagery, nor is it that overt. In fact, a great number of his pictures are really straight photography. Sorry, that's not meant to be a pun. Meaning that we've got, you know, things that you could see Ed Weston doing, or any number of people associated with the formalist tradition. Very beautiful compositions of flowers, and this is a tulip known as the Y series, right? So a calla lily. He also was famous starting in the early 80s for photographing celebrity culture, like Paloma Picasso here, Richard Gere here. He got famous for photographing. One of his favorite models for photographs of women was Lisa Leon, who was a female bodybuilder. And so you see these beautiful photographs that look very similar, frankly, to any number of photographs that could have been produced in the 20th century along the lines of the classical tradition. This one, it looks quite a bit like some of those surrealist photographs that we've seen. And, you know, marketing of Robert Mapplethorpe in exhibitions didn't miss this. This is the beautiful, you know, human body photographed, and see how it says as its title, Robert Mapplethorpe and the Classical Tradition, in order to legitimize this, right? It's just like all those classical nudes. And this is a huge component of his output, right? Many, many photographs like this of beautiful bodies, primarily. When he started to court, and it's not that these are the first images to do this, but where these things cross particular lines and are no longer understood as just coming from the classical tradition is when you compose a photograph of two male bodies, and in particular two male bodies of different ethnicities or races, a white body and a black body here. This, you know, for people, oftentimes critics coming from the right, was crossing these boundaries towards homoeroticism. Now, there's nothing overt about this per se, but, you know, it is one of those things that got some people uncomfortable about his photographs. Not nearly as much as we'll see as the X portfolio, but it is, you know, something that is not quite just a singular male and may bring in elements of homoeroticism. Now, these ones are clearly about homoeroticism, or frankly the erotization of the male body. Mark Stevens, Mr. 10.5 here, you know, putting him in leather chaps, focusing in on male genitalia, which had frankly not been done very often before. These were images that were produced in particular for the gay male population. And as I said from the outset, one of the ideas that Robert Mapplethorpe had in mind is that this kind of erotization of the male body, and frankly even for women, but in particular for other men, was something that was lacking in representations of within the West, in particular representations of men. And of course, he is a gay man. He you know, eroticizes the male body for his own pleasure, and does that in his photography. Man in polyester suit, once again, overt erotization of the male body, focusing on genitalia. He also courted controversy with this series of photographs of beautiful black male bodies, primarily because he was a white artist, and the idea of sexualizing the male black body for white men was something that seemed, you know, just another way of sexualizing black men. There are many, many stereotypes, I'm sure you're aware of them, of the sexual prowess and of black men, and the fear, frankly, that white men have of that sexual prowess, or beauty, or, you know, size of genitalia, or whatever it might be. And so when it is a white artist representing these men for erotic desire, the same argument that is you know, leveled at men who eroticize the women's body for their desire is leveled at these. It's an objectification of those male black bodies for a more privileged figure, the white male, even though he might be gay. Right? And some of these, with a figure looking away, are just beautiful objects. Others seem like passive recipients of the photographer's gaze. leading at least one artist, Rotimi Fani Coyote, to critique this in his own art in this untitled series in which he dresses up as the eroticized and very, by the way, primitivized masculine body there for, male desire. It's a way that this artist thought of the ways that white culture, the culture of the West in particular, primitivizes black culture, primitive sexual prowess, primitive bodies, and so he is dressed up this way, or rather he's had a model dress up this way and photographed it so as to critique it. This is something that pushing these stereotypes beyond their limits so that they become kind of silly is something that Bell Hooks once called the stereotypical grotesque. In other words, you take a stereotype and you push it so far that people can't take it seriously or treat it as if it is innocent any longer. Now, the series that he was most kind of critiqued for, and the series that created a lot of controversies, particularly for the National Endowment for the Arts and various funding for exhibitions that were meant to host these images, was a series known as the X series from the late 1970s. Now, the series originally was shown in San Francisco in a show called Censored, but part of the budget was supposed to come from the NEA, so it created a controversy around this. The National Endowment for the Arts, for those of you who don't know, is a government funding mechanism for the arts, which is supposed to be objective in the sense that we fund, the most legitimate and oftentimes the most kind of cutting-edge art out there without thinking too much about whether it breaks with various norms in American society. But over and again, that has proven not to be true, as we'll see, that people, especially politicians, use controversial art as a way to create wedge issues between the right and the left, and frankly to empty the budget of the National Endowment for the Arts. In any case, what Robert Mapplethorpe was interested in exploring in this series of photographs was gay S&M culture, which he wanted to represent, but also represent in a way that dispelled some myths about it. The first myth is that people, again, in the gay community, or frankly probably in any community that practice sadomasochism in the bedroom, are somehow completely weird people in real life. It's not for me here today to make a judgment one way or another on what happens in anyone's bedroom. But what he wanted to point out is that this is a kind of role playing that occurs that is about male, in this case, homosexual desire. It's not that these people walk around every day thinking only about sex or kind of extravagant sex. It's rather that this is a component of their sex life that they very much enjoy. And so, for instance, in this picture here of Brian Ridley and Lyle Heater, notice that he's playing upon old norms or old kind of traditions of the couple. One seated in the chair, the other standing by their side, although usually this is a woman and a man. Now we've got two men. He's also playing around with norms about decor, right? So look at the room here that we're seeing, how the windows are partially closed, how we have this kind of strange antler table off to the right-hand side, a fireplace off to the left-hand side. And then, of course, we have the things that, don't fit in a normal picture. We've got people dressed up, all in leather, chained up, one person with a riding crop, things that strike us as maybe even today kind of stereotypically S&M gay culture. However, where this gets really interesting is that I think you can tell that it's all fictional. It's all made up. The room that they're in doesn't look lived in. It looks like a set. This is a facade or a masquerade, as Judith Butler once put it. And then the other part is pretty interesting, as many critics have pointed out. It's not really clear. I mean, at first you'll look at the guy on the right and you'll think this is the guy who's in charge of everything. But of course, well, I shouldn't say of course. I'm thinking that for most of us, we would think that the guy who is standing up is the guy in charge. And yet when you look at this more and when you learn something about these kind of role-playing games, it is a situation where the guy who supposedly is in charge is doing things to the man who is sitting in a kind of mutually agreed fashion, that they're both in charge in some way, that is a chosen sexual kind of fantasy being played. Now, some of these pictures are going to get more graphic, which is why they became a wedge issue for the NEA and why various politicians stood on the floor of the Senate and denounced gay and lesbian culture for these excesses and thinking of these people as, frankly, weirdos or sexual deviants rather than, recognizing, I think rightly so, that, and I'm sorry, this is a tricky thing for me to talk about, but what happens in someone's bedroom and what people do there seems to me is no one's business but the people that are in that bedroom together. However, with that being said, he is making these images public in part to dispel some of the myths around sexual deviancy, and on the other hand, to acknowledge that a very important component, especially of his age, of homosexual identity was a kind of exuberant sex life. There was this argument out there that gay and lesbians, but particularly gay men, had been so prejudiced against for their sexual choices that one of the few freedoms and enjoyments that they had was really kind of exuberant, exploratory, prolific sex. And in many ways, the AIDS HIV crisis was, something that created a great deal of turmoil when it occurred in relation to this sense that, prolific sexual activity, multiple partners, exploratory sex now could have some pretty serious consequences to it. In any case, the fear that went along with AIDS, HIV, the fear that is also oftentimes coupled with, people who aren't familiar with gay and lesbian culture, coming across this, those are all things that he was trying to desensitize us to on the one hand, and also to embrace on the other. There's nothing to be ashamed of if this is your choice in life, he wanted to say. This is a very important component of a lot of gay people's life, and he wanted to create representations of that. Again, graphic images, anal penetration here in some of the images. On the one hand, many people will respond to this and say, this is grotesque, this is gross, I don't want to see that. There's no reason that you have to, of course. But it is something that was meant to say, there is such a thing as gay sexual desire, and it includes things like anal penetration. Now, one of the big controversies was that later on, this is after the major NEA controversies, a director of the Cincinnati Museum of Art was actually charged with a criminal crime for showing Robert Mapplethorpe's work in a museum. And part of the problem was that those works, although in the X series that is, though in its own special section with various signs up to alert people to graphic imagery, were shown in the same exhibition as these images of children. And this just, was a media frenzy, saying things that weren't true, that these pictures of nude children were, sexual deviancy and pedophilia and so forth. If you grew up in my age, which is, a little bit even younger than, a lot younger than Robert Mapplethorpe, but growing up in this age, pictures of kids without their clothes on, pretty much every family had these, and most of the images that Robert Mapplethorpe took of children were commissioned by their parents and just have to do with the innocence and beauty of the human body. However, this created, again, this huge, huge controversy and legal situation in which a director of a museum was charged with representing obscenity. Now, he was absolved of this in the end, but it had quite a chilling effect out there. Another one was that when the Corcoran Gallery refused to show a Robert Mapplethorpe retrospective right after he died, on the grounds that it was too controversial. And again, NEA money was involved, a huge community of art goers and GLBT members of the society. Q was not a word that was really invented yet, the queer population, or transgender wasn't a big word in the lexicon either, showed up at the gallery. And while I haven't talked about this quite a bit, it was a fairly big thing in the 1980s to project images, project photographic images on various buildings, and in this case create a kind of rally around this censorship of gay erotic art, or at least art that was partially erotic. Catherine Opie is in some ways a very similar photographer. One of her most famous series is a series of photographs of, today we would call them transgender, although they're not really always transgender people. These are cross-dressing women who were friends of hers. The series was called the Being and Having series. It started in '91, and I believe it still continues today. What she was trying to do here is not so dissimilar than the S&M series, the X series of Robert Mapplethorpe. She took these pictures, these kinds of portraits of her friends who were cross-dressing, in order to, again, draw attention to the way that cross-dressing in this case is not really about, as I understand it, not really about some of the issues that the transgender community is oftentimes dealing with today, which is creating a kind of gender fluidity, or someone who is biologically male identifying as a woman and thus playing the role or acting or masquerading or just living as a woman. What this was more about is, again, role playing, freedom in choosing to masculinize yourself from time to time. And what Catherine Opie often pointed out is that the masculinizing agents here are very often quite clearly fake and meant to appear fake. Like the mustache here is not meant to kind of convince anyone that it's a real mustache. It's a form of dress up. It's a form of liberation, a form of identifying, at least for a while, in masculine ways. I mean, here, if you look at this image up close, you can see all the netting, and that's on purpose so that Opie could say, for some of her friends, her lesbian friends, masculinizing themselves was something that they chose to do from time to time, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they wanted to be a man or they wanted to have a beard. It was a choice, and choice is a type of freedom. Some of the most difficult images that you'll see of Catherine Opie's are these types of works. Dyke is a quite pejorative, negative term thrown at lesbian women, and something that is very similar to the N-word for black communities at the time. It's meant as a hate word, and it's meant to belittle and to harm people. And so when this woman tattoos, as far as we can tell, this word on her back, it's just like the N-word was reappropriated by black culture as a word that could only be used by people of color within their own communities, and not something accepted to be uttered by whites. It's a type of kind of wresting away from white majority culture, a word that is a hate word, so as to, I suppose, on the one hand, desensitize this, not to make it okay for anyone to say, but rather to take it as your own. This is Catherine Opie's self-portrait from the Being and Having series. It's, for me, one of the most poignant images she ever produced. It's her back, and on her back she has scarified what looks like a child's image of a family, right? It's got the house, it's got the clouds, it's got what appear to be birds or something. And then instead of the typical mother-father, we have two, what I presume to be women, because they're wearing skirts, right? There's no child yet, though, because it's very hard at this time for lesbian couples to adopt children or to have children and both be caretakers of that child. on their own. And there's something about the poignancy of this being scratched into her back and the poignancy of it being like by a child that makes you think of all the difficulties that same-sex couples have when it comes to having children and raising children, all the prejudices that they must face, particularly in 1991, right? Some of these things have become less stigmatized today, but in 91, you know, it was right at the cusp of this becoming more common. This is her self-portrait as a pervert, again with forms of sadomasochistic play there, and the word pervert above her breasts and the mask on her head, right? Very similar to Robert Mapplethorpe's goals in this. This is a choice. It's about eroticism. It's about self-identity. Or her self-portrait nursing her child that comes along with all of these other pictures that you're aware of. And by the way, I don't know if you can still see it with our small photograph here, but the scarification of the body is still there from her earlier work. Now, just fairly quickly, I wanted to take you through a couple of other uses of photography by the GLBTQ community. Again, this is primarily in the late 80s, so Q wasn't a big part of the equation. And if those of you are wondering, queer is a term today that is used by various members of, frankly, GLBT A community, Q community, in order to point to the way that heterosexuality is a kind of norm against which people who are not participating in that norm are judged. Queering means to queer all types of norms by which people are judged so as to remove those stigmas and reduce the privilege that is conveyed to those who participate in the norm. In other words, to be queer is to identify with the project of queering normativity, of making it not a norm, opening things up to other possibilities. In any case, ACT UP is one of the major activist GLBTQ groups associated with and came to kind of rise during the AIDS, HIV crisis. ACT UP literally means the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. So in the 1980s, with the rise of AIDS, HIV, you know, there's a lot of hate speech out there in the world, and a lot of people saying some pretty horrible things about AIDS, HIV being, first of all, only a gay disease, and one that wasn't worth spending money on because people were deciding to participate in forms of sexuality that killed them. That's not really true. There are higher and lower risk forms of sexuality, and one of the things that, of course, led to the spread of HIV and AIDS in particular male gay population was a lot of prolific sex, oftentimes unprotected sex, and anal sex tends to be higher risk than other forms of sex, although not by a ton, right? In any case, this was understood as a gay disease by many. Unfortunately, it wasn't, but it did disproportionately affect this group. And so not a lot of money was spent in medical research. If you've seen any number of movies or documentaries around this, you'll know that you know, drug companies even didn't do a lot of work to produce the antiretroviral drugs that today help to keep people who have HIV relatively healthy. And the gay population, of course, was up in arms about these types of prejudices, while huge numbers of, you know, their friends and peers died at the time. So ACT UP created a series of vignettes in storefronts in Manhattan called Let the Record Show, and this is just one of those, based upon people who are seen as being outright enemies, if not, you know, just antagonistic towards gay and lesbian people. And here we have an image that is on the top. We've got a pink triangle up there. The pink triangle is a symbol of homosexuality was something that was originally used by the Nazis and tattooed on gays in the concentration camp who were slated for execution because they are degenerate. The phrase silence equals death at this moment is really straightforward. Up until 1969-ish, it was pretty common for gay and lesbian communities to say, listen, if we don't talk about the fact that we're gay or lesbian, people won't bother us, so let's all remain closeted. Excuse me here while I turn back on my lights. Oh, for crying out loud. Excuse me for a moment. Sorry about that. So it was very common for gay and lesbian communities to remain closeted, to not talk about their sex life. Why would you bring it up if you're only going to be prejudiced for bringing this up? And then in 1969, with the rise of gay activism, and in particular the so-called Stonewall riots in Manhattan, where at the Stonewall Inn, after various pressures by the police, gay community members created a kind of mini riot and drew international attention to the various prejudices against gay and lesbians in the United States. Gay activism continued to rise, and the idea of remaining closeted seemed like a no-win situation, right? If you remain closeted, never will anyone become comfortable or stop the types of hate and prejudice against GLBT communities. So then, with the rise of HIV and AIDS, of course, remaining silent really could lead to your death unless you had activism in the world, unless you drew attention to the plight of gays and lesbians at this time and the AIDS HIV crisis. You really could die. The photograph you see here, if you follow my cursor, of these people sitting in rows are actually photographs of the Nuremberg trials, in which Nazis were put on trial saying, and their common defense was, I was just following orders. I was just going along to get along. I wasn't in a position of power. What they're trying to say here is that, those of you who are remaining silent and aren't speaking up in support of homosexual communities are as complicit as those, who are put on trial for participating in the death camps. And then finally, a little photograph here in the bottom corner that is important here. This is William F. Buckley, who is a kind of cultural critic speaker, who once said in response to the AIDS HIV crisis that a solution would be to, quote, everyone detected with AIDS should be tattooed in the upper forearm to protect common needle users and on the buttocks to prevent the victimization of other homosexuals. He is actually advocating for a tattoo on people with AIDS, which is exactly, of course, what the Nazis did to gays to identify them as gay in the concentration camps. Now, again, there were many of these types of vignettes of people who were antagonistic, if not downright hateful, towards homosexuals at this time. Graham Fury is the propaganda arm of ACT UP. They took their name from the police cruiser, the Pontiac Grand Fury, that was used in New York at the time. They did posters in response to prejudice in the world. For instance, Rock Hudson, a famous actor well before most of your time, and a kind of heartthrob, was in a series known as Dynasty. It became clear at the end of his career that he was a gay man living a closeted life when he was diagnosed as having AIDS. And then people started worrying about, first of all, what other actors might be gay, but also whether his female co-stars could contract AIDS from being kissed by him, right? At the time, people were really, really fearful of HIV/AIDS, and there wasn't a lot of common knowledge around the fact that transmission of AIDS happens through blood and not through saliva, blood and semen in particular. and not through saliva. So in response to this kind of mass hysteria around the idea that kissing could spread AIDS, Grand Fury ran a series of poster productions known as the Read My Lips series. These were oftentimes advertisements for what were known as kiss-ins as well. So here you see that photograph. If it looks a little bit like Barbara Kruger, it's meant to, of two boys kissing. And again, it's supposed to draw awareness to the fact that AIDS, HIV is not transmissible through kissing, but there's another side to this too that I think is really important. You know, people, it seems to me, are pretty phobic about things that they have not come into contact with very often. So people who don't know or haven't come into contact with a lot of homosexuals will tend to be fearful of things that they don't know. However, becoming more familiar with or coming across, for instance, in this case, a representation of same-sex kissing can make us less sensitive to it. It can get us familiar with it. We stop worrying about this. After all, if this was a man and a woman, we wouldn't worry about it at all. But here, two men kissing, when we see a photograph of it, maybe it makes this less, makes us less sensitive to it. But in any case, the thing that they were also advertising were these kiss-ins, where at different times, in different places on a particular day, same-sex couples would kiss in public with the same idea involved, to show pride in being homosexual, to show a support for same-sex couples, and to desensitize others, and frankly make people aware that there are a lot of homosexually oriented people in the world every single day around you all the time, and to get us familiar with that. So here you see the original photograph. It's two kind of sailor boys kissing. You should also be aware, though, that these images had a kind of a little secret component to them, in that, in this case, this image comes from gay erotica that was, frankly, basically illegal at this time. And people who had seen this picture probably knew that it came from a cropped image, this one, that is a little bit more overt. The image that went along with, that was meant to advertise, let's say, lesbian same-sex affection is this one. It's actually a photograph from the first off-Broadway show, a theater show called The Captive, that had as its major subject lesbian erotic love. It was closed down during the first night, and laws were put on the book to forbid the representation of same-sex affection in New York City all the way up until 1969, believe it or not. So this image was used and was supposed to kind of be the female version of the one that you just saw, advertising kiss-ins and so forth. But then various members of ACT UP and Grand Fury pointed out that this also participates in a kind of stereotype about lesbianism, which that stereotype is that it's mainly about kind of women emotionally supporting each other, and the distance between these two staring in each other's eyes is more about a kind of platonic love rather than a sexual love. And so they added this edition, which is a Victorian photograph of two women kissing. Although, again, in this case, it doesn't convince me either. It seems, frankly, like one of them's into it and the other one's kind of laughing her way through it. In any case, the next series on this same idea was Grand Fury and ACT UP actually got a grant in order to create this series called Kissing Doesn't Kill, that borrowed from Benetton commercials of this same time period of mixed race couples to in this case sell Benetton clothing. But in this case you have not just mixed race couples, you also have same-sex couples kissing. When they first proposed this series of billboards across the United States and on the sides of buses and so forth to draw attention to to AIDS, HIV, and to desensitize people about homosexual couples, and frankly to promote gay pride. It looked like this. It said at the top, kissing doesn't kill, greed and indifference do. But then at the bottom, this rejoinder was placed on this that said, corporate greed, government inaction, and public indifference make AIDS a political crisis. Now, the organization that granted them money, the American Foundation for AIDS Research, told them to take that little rejoinder off the bottom so that when this series went up all over the United States, it looked more like this. Now, weirdly enough, of course, this created a political outcry, and one of the most vocal antagonists of this series of works was a politician in Chicago, Robert Shaw, who said that this was actually an attempt by gay and lesbians to recruit adolescents. I just find this hilarious, right? Like, if you see same-sex people kissing, suddenly you'll become gay. But that was his argument, and of course it played off the fears of, I suppose, many parents, and law was enacted forbidding the public representation of any kind of same-sex eroticism. But very quickly, this law that was like an emergency law put in place was contested by the ACLU and very quickly overturned, but not before Robert Shaw said, well, I don't care if you overturn it in law, people will take it into their own hands to vandalize all these images, which in the end they did. Now, ACT UP and Grand Fury did a lot of these indictments of public officials. Of course, Ronald Reagan presided over the beginning of the AIDS HIV crisis and went out of his way and is kind of, according to his own set of morals, to say that this was something that gay and lesbians could take care of on their own if they just stopped being gay and lesbian. So you see this, again, gay and lesbians have been targeted by the government, and this rejoinder, he kills me. They even took on the Pope and Catholicism, because of course Catholicism pushes the idea that any type of sexual contraception is against Christianity. So the use of condoms, which of course is one of the most effective ways to stop the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV/AIDS, is frankly forbidden by the Catholic Church at present. Now, I want to end here with the work of one major gay male artist who was also a very prominent photographer, David Wojnarowicz, who died as well of AIDS in 1989 or 1990, I believe. One of his most famous series, and again, he met with the same controversies, NAA controversies, people defunding his shows and so forth. But one of his most famous series is called the Sex series from 88-89. And what he did here is he put these, this is kind of a negative printing, so you're getting images in these little spherical areas here that are basically as if you're looking at a negative. Everything that is black becomes this kind of white, everything that would be white becomes this black, so they're hard to see. And the pictures are, I don't know, 14 by 14 or so every time I've seen them printed. He puts these little spherical insets in here in various locations around what seems to be a city. And almost always the scene of the city or the scene that you'll see seems at night and quiet and somewhat private. And it's as if you are looking through a peephole to see almost like what you would see inside one of these places where this is all sited. As he said it, the spherical structures embedded in this series are about examination and or surveillance. But now we have to see what is in these spherical negatively printed spaces, right? So we've got the woods. What is in those is gay erotica, right? So it takes a while to kind of recognize this. When you see it, you're like, what is that? What is that all about? And then you look at it and maybe you have an aha moment like, whoa, wait a minute, I think I'm seeing gay sexual acts. As Wojnarowicz went on, he said, quote, looking through a microscope or looking through a telescope, or the monitoring that takes place in looking through the lens of a set of binoculars. It's about oppression and suppression, right? People feeling like they're being watched, so they can't be themselves, they can't be comfortable being gay or lesbian, he's saying. And then he goes on to put this on you, like, what happens when you're in a gallery space? He says, quote, are you comfortable looking at these images of obvious sexual acts in a crowded room? Do you feel fear, judgment if you pause for too long before an image of sexual expression? Can you sense absurdity or embrace in the viewing of images? In other words, part of this is about drawing attention to the way that gay culture has to feel like they need to keep this private and can't be open with their sexual expression. You see why it's important, for instance, for people like Mapplethorpe and Opie to make these things public, to represent them, both to desensitize and destigmatize, but also to say we shouldn't have to closet all this. And then also to test others, like, if you come across this, even if you say to your friends, I am not homophobic, I don't dislike gay and lesbian or transgender, I'm totally fine with that, do you feel okay viewing these types of images in public around other gallery goers? Now, the final image from the series has 4 spherical insets here and a train snaking out of the distance. The one up in the upper left-hand side are riot police running through a gay rally, and these things often turn very bloody, as riot situations often do. These are, people advocating for gay and lesbian rights who are oftentimes brutalized at the hands of police. Down below that on the left-hand side are blood platelets, associated, of course, with HIV, as your blood count goes down. Your T-cell count goes down, that is. Up on the right-hand side is another gay erotic scene, and then on the lower right-hand side is a little snippet of what looks like, and it gives you enough indication to know it is, about gay bashing, someone being brutally beaten just for being gay, which continues to happen in our own world today with a frequency that is quite alarming. These were shown in a show that was partially funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, and this led a man who was a member of the American Family Association, Reverend Donald Wildman, to take it upon himself to take these images of gay eroticism totally out of context, to reproduce them in the the flyer that you're seeing here, and to send these out to 250,000 of his followers of the American Family Association, which again is a very kind of right-wing Christian organization, asking acerically if you were okay with your tax dollars paying for these, quote, works of art, right? They've been taken totally out of context. They're not captioned with anything. They're just sent out to create a controversy, right? And he actually sent these out in envelopes that said, warning, graphic material, and then you'd have to open it up and another envelope would say, no, really, warning, really graphic material. This is the back side of this, again, with those spherical insets, no context for these, just saying, how dare you reproduce these images of gay erotica, and your tax dollars are paying for this. Well, David Wojnarowicz, in one of the most brilliant moves in my estimation of his career, decided to make a big deal out of this, that he was being censored by the government. This is a photograph that he took where it looks like his lips are sewed together, censoring him, not allowing him to speak his truth. This was then reproduced on the cover of High Performance magazine, an alternative arts magazine, here raising the issue of why is Reverend Donald Wildman trying to censor this man by sending out 250,000 pamphlets to people, trying to create a huge stir and to shut this guy's shows down. And then he did something even better. He sued the American Family Association and Reverend Donald Wildman for copyright infringement. See, he had taken those images without the consent of the photographer, thus breaking rules of copyright. Now, he didn't ask for a lot of money, he just wanted judgment. you can't use my art, for your propaganda. And so he sued him in court, and he won, but he only asked for $1. And here you see the check that was drawn on the American Family Association's account for $1 to David Wojnarowicz, who very promptly framed this and exhibited this as art. Just one other very poignant image of, in this case, a doctored image, right? Not something you actually saw, but a photoshopped, in a way, image of bison falling off of a cliff. This is meant to be associated with the AIDS, HIV's huge human toll, right? Those dying of this, and associates it with, the way that the American bison, buffalo, were almost, led to extinction by people not caring about them, and by extension, the various genocides, including Native American populations before them. And then one of his very last works, the untitled Bandaged Hands series. It shows, bandaged hands, so a hurt person here, and it's accompanied, as most of David Wojnarowicz's work was, by really beautiful writing. And so, in conclusion, I just like to read you what this actually says. And think about this in terms of someone who is on, in their last days, thinking about their mortality and their invisibility, and how, they can no longer kind of think of themselves in the same terms as someone who is healthy. So this reads, quote, "Sometimes I come to hate people because they can't see where I am. I've gone empty, completely empty, and all they see is the visual form, my arms and legs, my face, my height and posture, the sounds that come from my throat, but I'm fucking empty. The person I was just 1 year ago no longer exists, drifts spinning slowly into the ether somewhere way back there. I'm a Xerox of my former self. I can't abstract my own dying any longer. I'm a stranger to others and to myself, and I refuse to pretend that I'm familiar or that I have a history attached to my heels. I'm a glass, clear, empty glass. I see the world spinning behind and through me. I see casualness and mundane effects of gesture made by constant populations. I look familiar, but I'm a complete stranger being mistaken for my former selves. I'm a stranger, and I am moving. I am moving on 2 legs, soon to be on all 4s. I'm no longer animal, vegetable, or mineral. I'm no longer made of circuits or disk. I'm no longer coded or deciphered. I am all emptiness and futility. I'm an empty stranger, a carbon copy of my form. I can no longer find what I'm looking for outside of myself. It doesn't exist out there. Maybe it's only in here inside my head, but my head is glass and my eyes have stopped being cameras. The tape has run out and nobody's words can touch me. No gesture can touch me. I've been dropped into all of this from another world, and I can't speak your language any longer. See the signs I try to make with my hands and fingers? See the vague movements of my lips among the sheets? I am a blank spot in a hectic civilization. I am a dark smudge in the air that dissipates without notice. I feel like a window, maybe a broken window. I'm a glass human. I'm a glass human being disappearing in rain. I'm standing here among all of you, waving my invisible hands and arms. I am shouting my invisible words. I am getting so weary. I'm growing tired. I'm waving to you from here. I'm crawling and looking for the aperture of complete and final emptiness. I'm vibrating in isolation among you. I'm screaming, but it comes out like pieces of clear ice. I'm signaling that the volume of all of this is too high. I'm waving. I'm waving my hands. I'm disappearing. I'm disappearing, but not fast enough. Well, thank you, and I will see you again next week.